The Outer Rim colony of Ardent 6 was not a place where people dreamed of better lives. It was a place where people worked, survived, and hoped not to be forgotten. Dust storms often swept across the metal streets. The sky was usually a pale shade of gray, and the sounds of heavy machines digging into the barren land echoed day and night. Most people who lived there were miners, traders, or scavengers. Among them was Daniel Hale, a salvage worker. He was a man of 35 years with strong hands, tired eyes, and the quiet patience of someone who had seen too many broken things. He had come to Ardent 6 after leaving Earth behind, looking for a place where he could live without being trapped in the endless politics of the core worlds. Life was not easy here, but it was simple. He searched the ruins left behind by the last war, gathered scrap metal, old technology, and anything that could still be repaired or sold. It was during one of these long salvage runs, out in the abandoned districts near the colony's borders, that he found her. The place was quiet. Broken towers leaned toward each other like dying trees. Cracks spread across the ground and old vehicles lay half buried in the sand. Daniel had been moving through the ruins for hours, carefully scanning for valuable pieces with his handheld scanner. Most of what he found was useless: rusted frames, broken circuits, and empty shells of machines that once had purpose. As he turned a corner into a collapsed alley, he froze. There, against the wall of a ruined building, was a figure. At first he thought it was just another lifeless shape, like so many skeletons left behind from the war. But then he noticed movement. The figure was small, thin, and wrapped in rags. A pair of large eyes blinked weakly through the dirt that covered her face. It was an alien girl. Daniel had seen her kind before, though rarely. They were called the Dahari. Once their people had been part of the Great Galactic Councils, but when their empire fell during the wars, everything changed. Rumors spread about them, that they carried diseases, that they betrayed their allies, that they were cursed. The name people gave them was cruel, unclean. On Ardent 6, no one would touch them, no one would speak to them. If one appeared, most would turn away or throw stones. This girl was one of them. She was covered in grime, her hair matted, her clothes torn until they were little more than strips. Her thin arms hugged her knees, and she trembled as if every breath cost her strength. Daniel's first instinct was caution. Everyone knew the colony's warnings. Do not approach the unclean. Do not let them near. They are too dirty to touch. But as he stood there watching her, something in him shifted. She looked at him, not with anger, not with hatred, but with fear. The kind of fear that came from someone who had never been shown kindness. Her lips moved, but no words came out, only a dry whisper. Daniel lowered his scanner slowly and took a step closer. "It's all right," he said softly, though he knew she might not understand his words. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl flinched and pressed herself against the wall as if she expected a blow. Daniel stopped moving. His chest tightened. This was not a dangerous creature, not some threat to the colony. This was a child, or at least young, no older than a teenager by human measure, left to rot in the ruins. He looked around. There was no one else. No family, no companions, just her. His thoughts wrestled inside him. He knew what the colony would say. Leave her. If he brought her back, people would spit at him, call him a fool. They might even demand she be cast out again, but Daniel had never been good at turning away. Slowly, he knelt down and opened his pack. He pulled out a canteen of water and held it out toward her. The girl stared at it, her eyes wide, then shook her head quickly as if afraid it was a trick. "It's water," he said gently. He took a sip himself, then held it out again. This time, after a long hesitation, she reached out with trembling fingers. The dirt on her skin was so thick it looked like dried clay. She took the canteen, lifted it to her lips, and drank greedily. The water spilled down her chin, but she kept drinking until she coughed. Daniel smiled faintly. "Easy there. There's more where that came from." When she finished, she tried to hand the canteen back. Daniel noticed she wouldn't meet his eyes. Her hands shook as if she expected him to strike her. He took the canteen gently and put it away. "Come on," he said softly. "You can't stay here," the girl tensed, not understanding. Daniel reached into his pack again and pulled out a protein bar. He broke it in half and offered it to her. She sniffed it cautiously, then nibbled, and for the first time a spark of life touched her expression. Daniel sighed. That was enough. He could not leave her here. He stood and extended his hand toward her. "Come with me." She stared at his hand as though it were something impossible.
Slowly, very slowly, she reached out.
Her dirty fingers touched his glove, then pulled back. She looked into his face with those large, fearful eyes searching for a trap. Daniel waited, his hand still out. Finally, she placed her hand in his. It was light, fragile, and it broke his heart. The walk back to the colony was long. Daniel carried most of her weight when she stumbled, her legs too weak to keep up. She didn't speak, only clung to him as if letting go would mean death. Every time they passed another scavenger on the road, Daniel felt the stares. Some muttered insults under their breath. One man spat near his boots and said, "You're mad." "Hale, that thing's too dirty to touch." Daniel ignored them and kept walking. When he finally reached his small home on the edge of the colony, he led her inside. It wasn't much, just a single-room dwelling with a workbench, a bed, and a water pump. But it was safe. The girl stood near the doorway, unsure if she was allowed to step in. Daniel set his pack aside and looked at her. "This is home," he said. "At least it's mine. You can stay here." She hugged herself tightly, eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to appear and drag her out. Daniel filled a basin with clean water and placed it on the table. He handed her a cloth. She took it hesitantly, staring at the water as though it was a treasure she'd never seen before. He smiled softly. "Go ahead. You're safe now." The girl dipped the cloth into the water and touched it to her face. Dirt came away in streaks. She froze, staring at the clean skin beneath as if she didn't recognize herself. Daniel turned away to give her space. He busied himself with unpacking, but his thoughts kept returning to her. What had happened to this child? How long had she been out there? And why had no one cared enough to help? The colony's laws were cruel. They had called her kind unclean, untouchable. But as Daniel listened to the quiet sound of water dripping, he knew he had made the right choice. For the first time in who knew how long, the girl was washing away the dirt of despair. And for the first time, Daniel felt that maybe he had found something worth more than any scrap in the ruins. Daniel's home was quiet, with only the soft hum of the generator in the corner and the faint smell of iron dust drifting in from the colony outside. Inside, it felt like a small shelter against the harshness of the world. But for the girl he had brought back, every sound seemed to make her flinch, and every shadow seemed like a threat. She sat near the door, her knees pulled close to her chest, staring at the basin of water as though it were something dangerous. The rag in her hand was damp, stained dark with dirt, but she held it like it was a fragile jewel. Daniel watched her for a moment. He had given her space, not wanting to scare her. She had already been through enough fear for a lifetime. Yet he knew this was not enough. The dirt and filth on her body were not just grime from the streets. They were years of neglect, of being treated as less than alive. If she was ever going to heal, the first step was simple, helping her see herself as clean. He filled another basin with warm water from the pump, then stood up slowly so he wouldn't startle her. "You need more than a cloth," he said gently. "You need a bath." The girl blinked, not understanding his words, but her body tensed as if expecting pain. Daniel raised his hands, slightly in peace. "No harm, just water, clean." He moved to the small side room that served as a washroom. It was nothing fancy, just a corner with a drain in the floor, a bucket system, and a curtain for privacy. Still, it was better than the ruins she had been left in. He poured warm water into the tub. Steam rose slowly. When he came back, she was still hugging her knees, unsure if she was even allowed to move. Daniel held out his hand. "Come on. You'll feel better." For a long moment, she did not move. Then very slowly she stood. Her legs wobbled, weak from hunger and exhaustion. Daniel steadied her gently, careful not to grip too tight. She didn't resist, but she didn't relax either. It was like holding someone who expected chains at any moment. He guided her to the washroom. When she saw the tub of steaming water, she froze. Her large eyes widened, and for the first time a faint spark of curiosity flickered through the fear. "It's safe," Daniel said, pointing at the water. "Just clean." The girl touched the edge of the tub. Her fingers trembled as they brushed the surface of the water. When the warmth reached her skin, she gasped softly. Then she pulled her hand back as though she had done something forbidden. Daniel gave her a small smile. "It's yours." "Go on." She looked at him, then at the curtain. After a moment of hesitation, she stepped behind it. Daniel waited outside, not wanting to frighten her. He listened as she lowered herself into the water. A soft sound escaped her lips, half a sigh, half a whimper. It was the sound of someone who hadn't felt comfort in years. Daniel leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. He thought about all the people who had passed her by, who had called her unclean, who had spat at the very idea of touching her. None of them had cared enough to offer even this simple gift. He heard splashing. He peeked just slightly, enough to see her rubbing her arms with the cloth, watching with wonder as the grime peeled away. Layers of dirt floated on the water's surface, revealing pale skin underneath, scarred in places but alive. Her hair, once a tangled mess of dust, spread in dark waves as she dipped her head. She rubbed again and again, as if afraid it would all vanish. Daniel smiled faintly and stepped back, giving her privacy. He busied himself by preparing a clean blanket and setting some food on the table. Time passed. When the sound of water slowed, Daniel knocked gently on the wall. "You all right?" There was silence. Then a soft sound, almost like a word, came from behind the curtain. Daniel frowned. "What was that?" The girl peeked out, wrapped in the blanket he had left nearby. Her hair clung to her shoulders, her face half hidden, but for the first time Daniel could see her eyes clearly. They were not the dull, frightened eyes he had first seen. They had a light in them now, a fragile light but real. She said something in her own language. The word was soft, melodic, and strange to his ears. Daniel tilted his head. "Is that your name?" The girl hesitated, then nodded slightly. He tried to repeat the sound, but it came out clumsy, broken. She gave him a faint look of confusion, then just almost smiled. It was the smallest curve of lips, but it was there. Daniel chuckled softly. "I don't think my tongue was built for your words. How about this?" He thought for a moment. Then he said, "Leora." The girl blinked. "It means light," Daniel explained, "because that's what I see when I look at you now. A light. Something worth saving," she whispered the word, testing it. "Leora," Daniel nodded. "Yes, Leora." For the first time, the alien girl had a name in his world. That night, Daniel gave her food. She ate slowly at first, suspicious, then with growing hunger. When she finished, she sat quietly on the floor near the bed, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Daniel worked at his bench, repairing a damaged scanner, but his eyes often drifted back to her. He saw the way she studied the room, the way her fingers touched the blanket as if testing whether it was real. When the generator flickered, the light dimmed. Leora gasped softly and pulled the blanket tighter. Daniel noticed and said gently, "It's all right. Just a power dip. Happens sometimes." She looked at him, her eyes filled with trust that hadn't been there before. She nodded slowly. Daniel smiled faintly. In the days that followed, life began to change. At first, Leora spoke little. She only whispered words in her own tongue, and sometimes she copied Daniel's speech with difficulty. But each day she learned more. Daniel showed her simple things: how to wash her hands before eating, how to use the water pump, how to sit at the table without fear. She watched everything with sharp eyes, learning faster than he expected. One morning, as he was preparing tools for another salvage run, he found her standing near the door, waiting. "You want to come?" he asked. She nodded. Daniel hesitated. People in the colony already whispered about him bringing her in. If they saw her walking beside him, it would be worse. But when he looked at her hopeful expression, he couldn't say no. "All right," he said softly, "but stay close." Together they walked through the colony. Heads turned. Whispers followed. "That's her. The unclean one." Hales lost his mind. Daniel ignored them, but Leora heard every word. She lowered her head, clutching his sleeve. He leaned down and whispered, "Don't listen. You're Leora. You're not what they say." Her grip loosened just a little. At the salvage yard, Daniel worked while Leora explored carefully. She touched old machines, tilted her head at broken wires, and even tried to mimic his repairs. When she smiled faintly at the spark of a tool, Daniel felt warmth in his chest. For the first time since bringing her home, she looked alive. That evening, after a long day, Daniel sat by the small heater with Leora wrapped in her blanket beside him. "You know," he said softly, "you don't have to be afraid anymore. You have a place here. With me." Leora looked at him. For a moment her eyes shimmered, and she whispered his name. Not perfectly, but enough to make his chest tighten. He smiled. That's right, Daniel, and you're Leora. She touched her chest gently, repeating the name. Then, slowly, she leaned against his shoulder. Daniel froze for a second, then let out a soft breath. He placed a careful hand over hers. The colony could whisper all it wanted. The world could call her unclean. But here in this small home she had a bath, a name, and a place. And for Daniel, that was worth everything. Life in Daniel's small home began to settle into a rhythm. Days passed, one after another, marked not by grand events but by small changes. Changes that meant the world to the girl now called Leora. At first, she had been silent, sitting quietly in the corner as though she did not belong. But slowly her silence began to fill with sound. She would whisper words Daniel taught her, simple words like water, food, home. Her voice was soft, broken at times, but each attempt was like a step across a bridge. Daniel had patience. He repeated words again and again, showing her objects, pointing, smiling when she tried. When she mispronounced something, he didn't laugh. He only encouraged. One morning, as the pale sun crept through the cracks of the metal shutters, Leora sat at the table holding a spoon. She pointed to it carefully. "Found a spoon," Daniel grinned. "That's right, spoon." Her lips curved in the smallest of smiles, and for Daniel, that was brighter than any sunrise. Beyond the home, though, the world was not so kind. When Daniel walked through the colony with Leora by his side, the stares grew sharper. People muttered under their breath. Some turned away in disgust. Others pointed openly. "Why bring that thing here?" one woman hissed to another. "He's going to poison us all," a man muttered as Daniel passed. "Unclean, filth." Leora heard every word. She would lower her head, her hands clenching the edge of her worn blanket. Daniel saw it and placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "They don't know you," he whispered. "Don't listen." But deep inside, Daniel knew it was only a matter of time before whispers turned into something worse. Inside the house, Leora began to show sides of herself Daniel had never expected. She had a sharp mind. When Daniel repaired old machines, she watched closely. Her eyes followed every movement, memorizing the way he held tools and connected wires. One evening, while Daniel stepped outside to gather supplies, he returned to find her at his workbench. She had taken apart a broken scanner. Pieces lay scattered, but not in a chaotic mess. They were arranged in careful order, as though she understood their purpose. Daniel froze at the doorway, surprised. Leora looked up quickly, guilt flashing in her eyes. She started to push the pieces away, whispering, Sorry, but Daniel raised a hand. "No, wait." He walked over and looked at the parts. You did this?" She nodded hesitantly, eyes wide with fear that he would be angry. Daniel picked up one of the parts, studying it. "This is actually right," he chuckled softly. "You're not just watching, you're learning." Leora tilted her head, confused by his tone. Daniel smiled warmly. "That's good, Leora. Very good." For the first time, pride lit her face. Days turned to weeks. The bond between them grew. Daniel began teaching her not only words but gestures, expressions, and small pieces of human life. Leora, in turn, began to teach him her ways, even if only through simple actions. She showed him how to weave strips of fabric into stronger rope. She showed him how to sharpen tools using stone in a way different from humans. Sometimes at night she hummed strange songs in her soft alien voice. The notes were gentle, haunting, yet soothing. Daniel never understood the words, but he knew they carried memories of a people who had once been more than the galaxy's outcasts. But peace could not last forever. One evening, while Daniel was repairing a mining lamp, there was a knock at his door. Heavy, sharp. He opened it to find two men in colony uniforms. "The overseers, Daniel Hale," the taller one said sternly. "We've received reports. You're harboring one of them." His voice dripped with disdain. Daniel crossed his arms. "Her name is Leora," the man sneered. "Call it what you want. You know the rules. The Dahari are forbidden within the colony walls. They're unclean, dangerous. You will surrender it at once." Behind Daniel, Leora peeked out from the shadows. The second officer spotted her and frowned deeply. "There, you see? It's a violation." Daniel stepped in front of her protectively. "She's not a danger. She's just a girl." "Just a girl?" the overseer snapped. Do you know how many died when her kind spread disease across the sector? Do you know the betrayals they caused during the war? They don't belong here. You don't touch them. You don't keep them. You throw them back where they belong." Daniel's jaw tightened. He thought of the day he had found her, trembling, covered in dirt, treated like trash. He thought of the spark in her eyes when she had learned her first word, the way she had begun to smile. "No," Daniel said firmly. "She stays." The officers exchanged glances. The taller one leaned forward. "You're making a mistake, Hale. The colony won't protect you. If you keep her, you put yourself against the law." Daniel's voice was low but steady. "Then the law is wrong." The overseer's eyes narrowed. "You'll regret this." With that, they turned and left, their boots echoing harshly against the metal ground. When Daniel closed the door, he saw Leora pressed against the wall, shaking. Her wide eyes shimmered with tears. She whispered, "Leave." Mira and Daniel knelt in front of her. "What?" She pushed the words out with difficulty. "Danger, me, hurt you." Daniel shook his head. "No, Leora, you're not the danger they are. You didn't hurt me. You saved me more than you know." She tried again, her voice breaking. "If I go." "Safe." Daniel took her hands gently. "Listen to me. You don't have to go anywhere. You belong here with me. You have a name, a home. I won't let them take that away." Her lips trembled. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. But all she found was certainty. Finally, she lowered her head and whispered, "Stay." Daniel nodded. Yes, stay. But the threat lingered. Word spread quickly through the colony. Daniel Hale, the salvage worker, was protecting an unclean. Some laughed at him, calling him mad. Others cursed him, claiming he was endangering them all. A few whispered differently. A few wondered if maybe, just maybe, the stories about the Dahari were not all true. But fear was louder than hope. Daniel could feel the walls closing in. The overseers would not let this go, and Leora knew it too. She began to watch the windows nervously, as though expecting someone to break in at any moment. Yet, despite the fear, she grew closer to Daniel. One night, as they sat near the small heater, she leaned against him again. He looked down at her and saw not the broken, trembling figure he had found weeks ago, but someone who was beginning to heal. Someone who, despite everything, still had the courage to trust. That night, Daniel lay awake, listening to the quiet breaths of the alien girl sleeping under a blanket in his small home. He thought about the overseers, the whispers, the danger pressing closer with each passing day. But he also thought about the word he had given her. Leora. Light. And he knew that even if the whole colony turned against him, he could not abandon her. For in giving her a bath, a name, and a place, he had found something rare in the cold edges of the galaxy. He had found a bond, and bonds once forged were worth any threat. The days that followed the overseer's visit felt heavy. Daniel could sense the change in the colony. Everywhere he went, eyes followed him. Some were sharp with anger, others filled with disgust. Even the few neighbors who had once greeted him with a nod now avoided his gaze. The whispers grew, louder. "That man is cursed. He's protecting filth. He'll bring ruin on us all." Daniel kept his head down, carrying on with his work. But he knew the truth. The colony would not let him keep Leora. Inside the house, Leora felt the tension too. She no longer hummed softly at night. She no longer touched the tools at the workbench with curious hands. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the streets with wide eyes, flinching at every sound of boots outside. Daniel tried to comfort her. "It's all right," he said often. "You're safe here." But he knew those words were becoming harder to believe. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, heavy knocks struck the door again. Daniel opened it to find not just 2 overseers, but 4, armed and stern. "This is your last warning, Hale," the leader said coldly. "The council demands the creature be removed from the colony. If you refuse, you'll be exiled as well." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Her name is Leora, and she's not going anywhere." The overseer's face darkened. "Then neither are you." Behind him, Daniel felt Leora's trembling hand grip his sleeve. She whispered his name softly, fear choking her voice. The officers gave him until sundown to decide. Then they marched away, leaving silence heavier than any storm. Daniel knew there was no choice. He began packing supplies, food rations, water, tools, spare blankets. Leora watched him with wide eyes, her voice shaking. We go? Daniel turned to her. Yes, if they won't let us live here, we'll live somewhere else. Her lips trembled. Because... Me. Daniel knelt in front of her. Because them, not you. You've done nothing wrong, Leora. Don't ever believe their lies. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. She lowered her head, whispering, Sorry. Daniel placed his hand gently on her shoulder. Don't be sorry. You gave me something this colony never could. A reason. For the first time that day, her eyes met his. As the sun fell behind the horizon, Daniel and Leora slipped quietly out of the colony gates. No one tried to stop them. No one wished them farewell. To the colony, they were gone already, erased like unwanted shadows. The wasteland stretched before them, endless sand, cracked stone, and winds that howled across empty plains. The sky was vast and merciless. Leora clung to Daniel's side, her steps small and uncertain. But Daniel moved with steady determination. He had walked these lands before during salvage runs. He knew where to find caves for shelter, where to search for hidden streams. Still, it was dangerous. Without the colony's walls, they were exposed to storms, wild beasts, and worse. On the second night, a sandstorm hit. The winds tore at their clothes, stung their skin, and made every breath feel like swallowing fire. Daniel struggled to hold the tarp above them as a shield, but his arms grew weak. Sand filled his mouth and eyes until he could barely see. When he collapsed, gasping, Leora pulled at him desperately. Daniel! He shook his head, his vision blurring. I can't. But then something happened. Leora crouched low, spreading her hands against the sand. Her eyes glowed faintly, a strange light shimmering within them. The storm seemed to bend around her. The winds lessened where they stood, as though an invisible shield surrounded them. Daniel stared, barely able to comprehend. Leora's body shook with effort, sweat pouring down her face, but she held firm. The storm raged around them, but they remained safe within her protective circle. When the winds finally calmed hours later, Leora collapsed beside him, panting heavily. Daniel caught her, holding her gently. Leora, what was that? She shook her head weakly, whispering, Dahari. Strength, hidden, not dirty, strong. Daniel's chest tightened. All this time, the colony had called her unclean, dangerous, worthless. But what he had just seen was not weakness. It was power, a gift her people had been forced to bury under lies. He brushed her damp hair from her face and whispered, You're not unclean. You're more than they'll ever know. Leora blinked slowly, exhaustion pulling her towards sleep. But before her eyes closed, she whispered, With you. Daniel held her close. Always. The days in the wasteland were hard. Food was limited, nights were freezing, and every shadow carried danger. But Leora grew stronger. Each day she walked farther without stumbling. Each night she hummed soft songs again, comforting both of them beneath the stars. Daniel noticed her abilities more and more. She seemed to sense storms before they came. She could find water where the ground looked dry. Once, when Daniel cut his hand on a jagged piece of metal, she pressed her palm over the wound. Within hours, the bleeding stopped and the skin knit together faster than natural healing allowed. Daniel stared in awe. You healed me. Leora tilted her head as if confused by his amazement. Normal, she whispered. For us, Daniel shook his head. No, not normal, incredible. She gave him the faintest smile. As they traveled farther, Daniel began to understand. The Dahari had not been unclean at all. They had been different, too different. Their resilience, their healing, their strange connection to the natural world, it had frightened others. And fear had turned into lies, into hatred, until an entire people were cast down. One night, as they sat near a small fire in a sheltered canyon, Leora spoke more than usual. Her words were still broken, but Daniel understood. Dahari, once strong. Skyships, cities, songs, then crushed, called, dirty, cursed to hide. Survive. Daniel listened quietly, his heart heavy. And now they're nearly gone. Leora lowered her gaze. Alone. Daniel reached out, gently lifting her chin so she would look at him. Not anymore. Her eyes glistened. She whispered his name softly as though it was the only anchor she had. Weeks passed. Together they faced hunger, storms, and loneliness. Yet despite the hardships, Daniel felt something he hadn't in years. Purpose. Each time Leora smiled, each time she learned a new word, each time she showed her hidden strength, Daniel felt the bond between them grow deeper. He realized something important. He had not saved her in the ruins. She had saved him too. She had given him hope in a world that had long felt empty. One evening, as the stars shimmered above, Daniel spoke aloud, his voice thoughtful. "We can't keep running forever. Leora, we need to find a place where they can't touch us, a place where you can live without fear." Leora tilted her head. "Place for me?" Daniel nodded. "For us. A new start." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. She whispered, "Home." Daniel's heart tightened. He placed a hand on hers and said firmly, "Yes, home." For the first time since leaving the colony, they did not feel like exiles. They felt like builders of something new. And in that moment, Daniel knew. The world had called her unclean, but the truth was the opposite. She was light, strength, and survival itself. Together, they would prove it. The wasteland stretched endlessly, but for Daniel and Leora, every step forward carried a quiet determination. They had left behind walls of suspicion, and though the road was hard, their bond grew stronger each day. Daniel often walked ahead, scanning the horizon, while Leora followed close, her steps light but steady. She no longer walked like a broken soul, afraid of every sound. Instead, she walked with her head a little higher, her voice stronger when she spoke. The world had once called her dirty. Now, Daniel saw her as nothing less than extraordinary. The valley of life after weeks of wandering, the land began to change. The harsh dunes gave way to low hills and the dry air softened. Green appeared, small at first, then growing into wide stretches of grass. Birds circled above, and in the distance they heard the sound of flowing water. Daniel slowed, his breath catching in surprise. "Leora, look." Her wide eyes followed his hand as he pointed to a valley below. Trees clustered near a winding river. Wildflowers colored the ground. It looked untouched, a pocket of life hidden from the wasteland. Leora whispered in awe, "Beautiful." Daniel smiled for the first time in many days. More than beautiful. This could be it. They climbed down into the valley, moving carefully. The air was cooler here, the soil soft beneath their boots. Daniel knelt, scooping water from the river into his hands. It was clean and sweet. Leora crouched beside him, dipping her fingers into the stream. She laughed softly, a sound Daniel had rarely heard from her, but it filled him with warmth. "Yes," he said firmly, "this is where we'll build. Building a home." The first days in the valley were spent gathering. Daniel collected wood, stones, and anything useful for shelter. Leora helped as much as she could, though she often paused to watch the river or listen to the forest sounds. Her people had been close to nature once, and it seemed the valley awakened something inside her. Daniel taught her how to tie branches together, how to layer stones for strength. Slowly, a simple hut took shape. It wasn't much, just walls of wood and a roof of leaves, but it was theirs. At night, they sat by the fire outside, eating what they had caught or gathered. Daniel noticed how Leora's smile came easier here, away from judging eyes. She was learning more words, too, her sentences longer, her meaning clearer. One evening, as the firelight danced, she looked around the valley and whispered, "Not exile, gift." Daniel tilted his head. "Gift?" She nodded. "World. Gave us place, for us, not theirs." Daniel thought about that and realized she was right. The colony had pushed them out, but in doing so, they had opened the door to something greater. The threat returns, but peace did not last. One morning, as Daniel was repairing the roof, he spotted movement on the ridge above the valley. Dark shapes, several figures watching. His chest tightened. "Leora," he called softly. She stepped out from the hut, her eyes narrowing as she followed his gaze. Shadows of men stood on the ridge, weapons glinting in the light. Daniel knew instantly. The colony. They had come looking. By the time the group descended into the valley, Daniel stood firm with an old rifle in his hands. Leora stayed close, her expression unreadable but her body tense. The leader of the group, a man Daniel recognized from the colony guard, sneered. "So it's true. You're living with the creature, building a life with it." Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "Her name is Leora, and yes, we live here now. Leave us in peace," the man spat on the ground. "Peace? You shame us, Hale. You protect filth and call it family. We cannot allow this insult." The guards raised their weapons. Leora's hand gripped Daniel's sleeve, but her eyes no longer showed fear. They glowed faintly, like when she had bent the sandstorm. Daniel whispered quickly, "Stay behind me." But Leora shook her head. For the first time, she stepped forward. Leora's true strength. The guards jeered, one shouting, "Look at it, trying to be brave." But then the wind shifted. The air thickened. Leaves rustled, though no storm was near. Leora raised her hands, her eyes blazing with a strange light. The earth beneath their feet trembled. A ripple of power spread outward, knocking some of the guards back. Daniel stared in awe. Leora's voice rang out, clear though her words were simple. "No." "More." The men froze. Their sneers vanished, replaced by wide-eyed fear. Daniel stepped beside her, his rifle steady. "You heard her. Leave. Now." For a long moment, silence hung heavy. Then slowly the guards backed away. The leader's face twisted with anger, but he gave no order to fight. They retreated to the ridge, their shadows fading into the distance. When they were gone, Leora collapsed to her knees, her body shaking. Daniel rushed to her side. "You did it," he whispered, holding her close. "You stood against them." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady. "Not dirty, strong." Daniel's throat tightened. "Yes, Leora. Stronger than they'll ever understand." A new beginning. After that day, the valley became more than a shelter. It became a promise. Daniel worked harder, expanding their hut into a small home. He built a fence around their garden, taught Leora how to plant seeds, and together they watched green shoots rise from the soil. Leora sang often now, soft melodies that seemed to blend with the river's song. Her laughter grew more frequent, her words clearer. Sometimes she told Daniel stories of her people, of the Dahari cities that once reached the skies, of songs that could heal, of powers that flowed through every child. Daniel listened with quiet respect. The world had stolen so much from her kind, but in Leora a piece of that light still lived. One evening, as the sun painted the valley gold, Daniel turned to her. "Leora, do you know why I gave you that name?" She tilted her head, curious. "In my language," he explained, "it means light, because that's what you are to me. You brought light back into my life." Her eyes shimmered, and for the first time she whispered her reply without hesitation. "Then, you are home to me." Legacy seasons passed. The valley flourished. Trees bore fruit, the garden grew strong, and the river never failed them. Daniel grew older, his hands rough from work, but his spirit stronger than it had ever been. Leora thrived. She no longer looked like the frightened figure Daniel had once found in the ruins. She stood tall, her gaze steady, her voice clear. She was not just surviving, she was living, and together they built more than a home. They built a world where names were given with love, where touch was not denied, and where no one was called too dirty. The humans' world years later, when wanderers sometimes found the valley, they were met not with suspicion but with welcome. Daniel and Leora shared food, water, and kindness. The story spread, of a man who gave a forgotten being a name, and of a woman once shunned who held the strength of the earth itself. To those who listened, it was more than a story. It was proof. Proof that humans could give hope, and that the Dahari, once broken, still carried greatness. And to Daniel, every time he looked at Leora, it was simple. He had not just saved her. She had saved him. Final scene, on a quiet evening as stars filled the sky, Daniel and Leora sat side by side at the riverbank. The water reflected the starlight. The valley was alive with the sounds of crickets and gentle wind. Leora leaned her head on Daniel's shoulder, her voice soft but strong. "Too dirty. No light life," Daniel smiled, wrapping his arm around her.
"Yes, and this world, our world, belongs to us." The two of them sat in silence watching the stars. No longer exiles, no longer broken. They were home.